Welcome everyone to another Action for Happiness live event. It's fantastic to see hundreds of you joining from all around the world for this very special event this evening on the topic of happier together. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Jon Yates. Jon, nice to see you.
Great to be here with you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
I'm particularly excited about this because I've been raving about your book called Fractured to many people, in fact anyone who listened, for some months now, ever since I read it. And I found it not only really sort of enlightening about the situation we're in, but also something that I found really personally helpful as well. So thank you for writing it. Folks, for those of you joining, as always, lovely to see you on the chat. Let's keep the chat friendly, constructive, relevant. And also the Q&A is open. So after Jon and I have had a conversation about a range of themes to do with this topic, we'd love to also have your questions for Jon and things that have come up for you. And we're also going to, as always, try and get you involved in the chat with a couple of interactive questions. Really keen to hear your responses to this topic. But I'd like to start, as well as welcoming all of you, with giving Jon a chance to sort of say a bit about, your background, Jon. Maybe you could tell us a bit about what you do and why this topic's of so much interest to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. I mean, so my day job, I run a charity focused on reducing violence. That's what I spend my day doing. But I spend most of my time thinking about how do we build a stronger community for us all to be happier in. And that question of like, why do I care so much about this? I think I was wrestling with this as I wrote the book. And I think, as with so much, these things often go back to our childhood, don't they? I was never cool at school, and the fact I was not cool is a total mystery. And by that, I don't mean it's mysterious that I wasn't cool. I mean, there are so many possible reasons for me not to be cool. It's quite hard to work out exactly which was the cause of it. It's a bit like a murder mystery where anyone could have done it. So I was overly academic. I was not good at sport. My dad was a I mean, there were just a colossal number of reasons for me not to be cool. I was grown to being different. And that sense of how does it work when actually you're with people who you think aren't totally like you? And how does society work like that? And then as I grew up, I look back on my life a few years ago. Great, a real privilege. But Oxford is divided into this sort of town versus gown mentality, which is basically code for saying there's some people who wear a gown because they study at the university and that's what they like to do. And there's some people who live in the town. And there was this tension between the two. Then I ended up working in a really deprived but lovely part of the East End of London, which was incredibly ethnically mixed, which I found just fantastic, except no one really mixed. And I find myself thinking, where is the space where people can come together? I finally then moved into working in the city, and I worked in this firm that was had people from all over the world, different religions, different race, different backgrounds. And I thought, finally, I found a place which isn't a bubble, until I realized that nobody in this firm was poor. No one had any financial worries at all, and no one knew anyone with financial worries. And I just was struck how much of our life is full of these little bubbles, and it started to trouble me. And I knew that there's a different way of doing things.
Well, that's lovely to hear the story to what got us to here. And I think before we dive into some of the really important insights in your work, maybe take a moment to reflect on the big picture right now, because it feels as we look around the world that we're more polarized perhaps than ever before. And there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of people seeing the other as evil. And I wonder if we could just hold space to recognize that a little bit before we perhaps turn to some of the solutions. How do you see that sort of big picture situation?
Yeah, so I think, we look around us, and we have got real problems with division. So if you ask Brits, here we are in Britain today, talking to each other, half of British people say that their country has never felt so divided. In the United States, you pick up the same thing. 80% of Americans say that their communities feel either entirely or mainly divided. And we pick this up in our politics. Our politics feel more fractured. People aren't just wrong, they're actually evil. We pick this up, I think, in our communities. People have much lower trust. It's not appalling. There's lots of great stuff, but people have less trust of strangers than they used to have. And you pick this up in the hope that many of us have for our institutions, for our leaders, this sense that actually somebody's on the take, someone's on the make. People unlike us are up to something, and it's such a loss. And I think the thing that I notice most of all is it doesn't have to be this way. Firstly, and secondly, this stuff really affects our well-being, our happiness, and there's a different way of thinking about this stuff, which is more empowering and more positive.
So I'm looking forward to us exploring the positive and empowering, but there's a concept you bring up in your work and a simple phrase which you call people like me. And I think that's sort of at the heart of both what causes some of these problems, but also perhaps how we can think about the solutions. Would you like to say a little bit about what this people like me tendency is?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there was a man called Francis Evans who in 1950 decided to travel up and down the coast of the United States, and he followed 150 salespeople going door to door. The first job I ever did was door-to-door sales, Mark. It was great fun, but also colossally hard work. Anyway, Francis Evans followed these 150 salespeople, and he tracked who they made sales to. And what he was kind of interested in is, are there good salespeople? Are there bad salespeople? But what he discovered was something completely different. What he found was that people were more likely to make a sale if the person buying voted the same way that they did. A person was more likely to make a sale if the person buying had the same level of income as they did. A person was more likely to make a sale if the person buying was the same height as they were. What Francis Evans had discovered back in 1953 was that we have this small, and it is small constant bias towards people like me. And there's been 39,000 studies that have all come to the same conclusion. There's one amazing one here in England where there were two schools, one called Breeze Hill, one called Count Hill, that were really near each other in the town of Oldham. And they were roughly the same size, about 700 pupils. They roughly got the same sort of results in exams, same sort of areas from an income point of view, very similar schools. One difference. One of the schools was entirely British Asian children, and the other school was entirely white British children. And it was decided to merge the two schools together and create a new school called Waterhead Academy. And a group of researchers decided to see what would happen. And they watched particularly the lunch hall. Why the lunch hall? Well, at lunchtime, children get to choose who they sit next to. And they tracked who will they sit next to. Now, the first thing they found was that the white British students and the Asian British students didn't sit next to each other very often. That's not surprising. These children have been educated in completely different schools. It's the second thing they found that's really interesting. They found that children with ginger hair, like me, tended to sit next to other kids with ginger hair. And children who need glasses, normally like I do, tend to sit next to children with glasses. They discovered exactly the same thing, 60 years later, exactly the same thing as Francis Evans, that we have this small, constant bias towards people like me.
So that's obviously behind some of our tendency to create outgroups and see people as different. But I guess there's also something kind of wonderful about the fact that we are for every outgroup, there's also an in-group, but we have this need to feel connected, to want to be with people like us. And of course, in a moment, we can come on to some of the challenging effects that come out of that sort of almost tendency, bias, whatever you want to call it, that we have within us. But I wonder if we could maybe turn to the audience, as we love to do in these events, and actually just connect with people. So folks, think about for a moment, where is it in your life you connect with people who are like you? Why don't we just take a moment to reflect on what that is? Maybe that's in your community, your work, your school, where do you meet people who you feel are like you, where you feel a sense of camaraderie, similarity, friendship, connection? So I'm just going to read a few of these out. So people are saying work, sports clubs, yoga, church, my group I'm part of, spiritual center, pub, prison, university, music interests, work with horses, through Action for Happiness, through soccer, and neighbors, volunteering. It used to be my church, Zumba, Buddhist practice, music, tennis, carers, hospice, retirement community. I mean, first of all, what a lovely, diverse set of examples. What are you feeling and seeing as you hear that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to celebrate that people can find places to connect, and there is a danger in everything that we think everything's awful, right? Actually, connecting to people who we have things in common with is good. Like, there's nothing by itself that's awful about connecting with someone who has something in common with you. I love The West Wing. I suspect some people listening love the West. People have never heard of it, and some people hate it. It's an American show about politics. I adore it. It's totally good that sometimes I get together with other people who love that show and have a chat. I love football. I'm obsessed by football. It's good that sometimes my poor wife doesn't have to suffer me talking about football. So some degree of people like me is a good thing. And so we shouldn't sort of think the whole world is appalling. It's just that some of it is problematic.
Yeah, so let's come on to that then. So, well, first of all, thank you everyone in the chat for sharing those really lovely examples of connection. And I fully echo everything you've said. And what we often say in the Action for Happiness community is kind of get together with like-minded people. But what is it about the people like me syndrome that causes us problems? Where does this create some of this division that we see?
Yeah, so the problem is the ripple effect of all of that bias and where it takes us. We had a teacher at my school who was a chemistry teacher who we used to cause trouble for, and I apologise for it. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thurston, we shouldn't have done it. But the most annoying thing we did was hum. Right. And so what would happen is if one child hums, it's not the end of the world. You can spot whose mouth is pursed together making the noise. The problem is if all the children start humming, it's actually quite a loud noise and it's quite hard to work out as a teacher how to stop. People like me syndrome is the same. A little bit of choosing to spend time with people like me is okay. It's when we all start to do it, it starts to affect our society. What do I mean? Well, if we look at our friendships today, on average, what we find, and this is true across most of the West, and the data of the rest of the world is less good, but I think we'll find the same. And so half of people in the West who have degrees spend nearly all of their time with people with degrees. The vast majority of pensioners have no contact at all with people under the age of 35, apart from people they're related to. There are some great exceptions to this, but this is generally the picture. The half of us have no friends from a different ethnic background. If we think about the Brexit vote, which is a big deal obviously here, a quarter of people who voted to leave have no friends who voted the other way. A quarter of people who voted to remain have no friends who voted the other way. And the biggest divide of all socially in our friendships, here at least in the UK, is wealth, is income. So if you're a barrister operating in London, earning quite a lot of money, how many people in your social circle would you have to invite round before you invited someone who was unemployed? 10, 20, 30, 100 people. You have to invite 100 people to have a chance of inviting someone who is unemployed. Now, that level of division actually really matters, and it starts to have a real impact on how happy we are, on our well-being. Mark, can I give you an example of where we see this really clearly? So there's a town in northern Pennsylvania called Roseto. And Roseto is super, super interesting. And there was a man who was a doctor called Stuart Wolf, who worked at the University of Oklahoma. And he went to give a talk quite close to Roseto. And at the end of the talk, a bit like this, someone came up and said, Mr. Wolf, you've got to come and visit the town of Roseto. It's remarkable. And he said, okay, what's remarkable about it? And he said, and this is back in the 1960s, no one there dies of a heart attack. He said, this is ridiculous. At the time, heart attacks were the #1 killer of men under 65. The #1 killer. It was a huge problem. No one in Roseto ever dies of a heart attack. So Stuart Wolf thinks, well, I'll go and visit, but this is clearly mad. And he gets there, he finds a town of 2,000 people, mostly Italian Americans, doing all the sorts of things that make you more likely to have a heart attack. So they smoke cigars, they eat biscotti, little sugary biscuits, they don't take exercise, they are not making the right choices. But he decides to go to the hospital and look at the data. Sure enough, no one in Roseto for years and years and years under the age of 65 has died of a heart attack. What on earth is going on? And he becomes obsessed. And he notices something amazing about the town of Roseto, which is in a town of 2,000 people, there are 22 different organizations and community groups connecting people together, whatever age they are, whatever background they are, whatever income they are. People spend time in each other's gardens, having picnics together, doing barbecues. He is struck by how connected the community is. Here's the kicker. 50 years later, those clubs and societies in the town of Roseto have largely drifted away. People are much less connected than they were. And the community life in Roseto is roughly what it is in the rest of the United States. You are just as likely to die of a heart attack in Roseto as you are anywhere else in the United States. This stuff really affects how happy and healthy we are.
Mm. And I was really struck when I read your book by, just to recap really on a few things you said. So I was embarrassed, I think is the right word, and shocked to discover the extent to which my life is in bubbles. You know, obviously doing the work I do, I tend to connect with a lot of people who naturally care about happiness and well-being. That's wonderful, but it doesn't really, I mean, I guess that's one interesting thing there is, of course, we do discover, and I work with a lot of people who are incredibly unhappy because of the nature of what we're doing. So I think there's a lot of diversity there. But I don't know that many people who have a very different educational background to me. Although I have friends from a whole range of ethnicities, you know, actually, I live in a pretty undiverse area. And this thing about, you know, well, how many people do I know right now who are unemployed? You know, it's vastly different to other parts of the country and other people's experiences. So I was I'm always aware of that, but you really highlighted the extent to which, even though I think of myself as someone who likes to connect with people from all backgrounds, the reality is different, not so much by choice, but by nature of where I've ended up and the journey I've been on. So just recognizing that feels like a start, but it also really motivated me to want to find places where I can connect with people from completely different backgrounds. And so I've found a few. One was volunteering at a vaccination centre and meeting people from kind of like a whole range of backgrounds there. But where are some of the places that are really good at bringing you together with people who aren't like you traditionally?
Yeah, and it's the absolutely key question, because the danger we fall into here is we say, yes, you're right, I can see that I'm not very well connected with people other than me, and apparently there is evidence that makes that will mean I'll be more anxious, I should connect. And then we turn into, I'm a bad person, it's my fault, you're not a bad person. It's not about you. You know, we have this small bias and it will play in. The key thing is a strong society has places that makes this easy. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go back in time a little bit to just kick us off. There's a group of people who live in northern Tanzania, just off the coast of Lake Eyasi, who are called the Hadza. Now, the Hadza, I would argue, are the most interesting people on God's great earth. They are just remarkable people. So there's 4,000 Hadza, and they have lived in the same part of northern Tanzania for 60,000 years. And they're hunter-gatherers. So they hunt and they gather as their way of living in the modern era. That's not the most interesting thing about the Hadza. The most interesting thing about the Hadza is something they do once a month. Once a month, when the moon is gone from the sky and everything is pitch black at the end of the day, the Hadza gather together with other Hadza who sleep nearby, and they perform something called the apem. Now, the apem is basically a dance, and this is how it works. The first Hadza goes and hides behind a set of trees and comes out, and the Hadza is wearing a set of ostrich feathers that are black, a cloak that is black, is holding a rattle which is shaken, and some bells around a leg, and that person leads off a dance, and the other people join in, the other adults join in, then the children join in, and they dance together, and this lasts with different people leading off for 2 or 3 hours. Why are they doing it? What is the point of this dance? It's been going on for thousands of years. It plays no part in their economy. It doesn't help them gather things or hunt things. It plays no part in their religious beliefs. They don't have an established set of religious beliefs. It's no part in their politics and their disputes. What on earth are they doing? A group of anthropologists got funding to follow the Hadza for a decade. I don't know how they got the money, but they got funded to follow them for a decade. And they got fascinated by, who do the Hadza trust? Who do they share tools with? Who do they bed down for a night with? Who do they gossip with? And the researchers found two really striking things. The first thing is the average Hadza, first of all, to people in their close family. We look at the Hadza as one group. They don't. They see a set of distinct families. The first bias is towards people in the family, people like me. The second bias is the key. The second bias the Hadza have is to other people they dance the appem with. And actually, they are more trusting of people they dance the appem with than with people who are in their own family. And the key thing is that appem dance, they don't pick who dances. It's whoever's nearest. Now, that institution throws people who seem different together and builds trust. We don't even have a word for it in most Western societies for an institution that does that. I suggest we call it the common life. Now, when you look through the sweep of human history, you can see these common life institutions all over the place. And you can see them when we were foragers, like the Hadza. You can see them when we were farmers. They tended to be rites of passage or feast days. And those were a big deal. So, 1 day in 5 would be spent on a feast day in medieval England, for example. When we were factory workers, I'm talking now about our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they were things like clubs and societies, which boomed out of nowhere. They also, though, were the local school. There was no mandatory schooling anywhere in the West before the sort of back end of the 19th century. Suddenly, this new common life institution, primarily aimed to educate people, but actually connecting people who thought they were different together. And the workplace. Most people just worked in the local workplace. Not everyone, it's not perfect, but it connected people together. What have we lost? We've seen the decline of clubs and societies. Every generation since the Second World War here in the UK is less likely to join a club and society than the one before. And we see in our schools and in our workplaces, the more choice we have, the more, unfortunately, that bias, that little bias skips in, and the more divided they become. So we have had these institutions. We need to get them back, but that's what we've had.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And you talk about this phrase, the common life, and how important that's been historically. What are some of the, we've talked about the reasons why we have a people like me bias, but what are some of the benefits for us individually, but also for all of us collectively, if we could strengthen that common life, if we could spend more time connecting across boundaries and so on?
Yeah, so let me give you some great benefits that are worth going after. So the first is happiness. That feels like the one we should be obviously with this great group of people. That's the one I really want to talk about. There's an amazing study that was done by two researchers where they got pairs of people together who were strangers to talk to each other. They got people from different ethnic backgrounds to spend time together. And they particularly focused on people who had views of people from other racial backgrounds that were negative, and they put them together. And what they found is that these groups of people who had anxieties about the other, anxieties about different, in their very first meeting, they picked up a change in something called cortisol. Now, cortisol is basically a stress reflex. People probably know this. Like it's something you use when you get stressed. So if you're watching a horror movie, you'll get a hit of cortisol. If you're trying to run to catch the bus, you'll get a hit of cortisol. Why on earth would you get a hit of cortisol while you're having a meeting with a stranger? The point is you're anxious, you're feeling anxious, and cortisol levels rise. Cortisol is super useful for like short-term bursts of energy. It's super damaging for long-term. So if you feel a long-term sense of stress around people who are strangers, it's really, really bad for you. And actually it affects most of your system. So it can affect your lungs, it can affect your kidneys, it does affect your nervous system. It's not good for you at all. Let me flip quickly though into the positive news. They managed to convince these people to keep meeting. How many times did they have to meet before they started to trust each other? 10 times, 100 times, 50 times, 3 times. By the third meeting, all they're doing is chatting and playing cards. By the third meeting, there was no bump in the cortisol level. And this is the really lovely thing. The people who had gone into that study, who had these negative views of people who are ethnically different, having done those 3 meetings, months later, spent more time interacting with strangers from different ethnic backgrounds than they had before. Just from interacting. So for the first one is this sense of positivity. People like me syndrome is not a hatred of the other. It's an anxiety about the other, and it can be reduced, and it makes us feel happier and more at home. But a second big one is fairness. I don't know how widely known this phrase is, but where I grew up, people would often say it's not what you know, it's who you know, if you want to get on in life. And the truth is that's correct. So 40% of jobs across the West on average tend to go through word of mouth. There's a really interesting thing that we can learn here. Look at somewhere like Utah. Okay, let's look at Utah just very, very briefly. A child growing up in Utah has a better chance of pretty much anywhere in America of getting on in life if they come from a poor background. So someone who's a poor child has a chance of getting to the top more than pretty much any state in America. Presumably that must be because they invest more in schools in Utah, or they've got a high employment rate, or they particularly support universities. No, it's not because of that. If we look at the city, the capital city of Utah, they spend less on schools than pretty much any state anywhere in the United States. They spend less on schools. What is it? It's the fact that 49% of people in Utah are Mormons. I'm not saying we should all become Mormons, but they're Mormons, and they go to the local temple to worship, and they go to the local temple. They don't choose, they go to the local temple, where they're thrown together with people from different income brackets. And so their children, whatever income bracket you're coming from, mix and connect and get on. If we want our children to have chances in life, we need to connect. It really is that simple.
Well put, Jon. Thank you for those lovely examples. Let's turn back to the community again. So wherever you are in the world listening to this right now, I'd love you to just bring to mind some places where you feel able to connect with people who aren't like you. We talked earlier about connecting with like-minded people. Where is it in your life you do have a chance to meet people from different backgrounds, different income levels, different viewpoints? Let's just share a few of those on the chat so we can see what comes up. So church, work, traveling on the train, volunteering, Alcoholics Anonymous, the library, choir, sport, parties, local college, swimming class, yoga, community cafe, Toastmasters, cycling, at the park with the kids, in a supermarket, at school, community groups, ballet, shared interest groups, volunteering in church again, A&E, interesting accident and emergency in hospital, Zoom meetings at the pub. So I'm finding that really inspiring again. And isn't that interesting? Because there's quite a lot of similarity to the places where we meet people who are very similar to us. But actually, we're also seeing some things that I think are more naturally taking us across socioeconomic divides, like a pub, like a choir, for example. How are you feeling in response to that lovely list again, Jon?
I think that's encouraging. And the other encouragement we should know is of all, it's going to sound an odd way to think about it, but of all the species in the world, we are the best at connecting with other people. Humans are really well adapted to connect with others. Just take one example, laughter. Why do we laugh? Right? Why do we do it? So is it the same as if someone, if you need to sneeze, it's an automatic reaction? That you need to sneeze, you sneeze. Someone says something funny, you laugh. Is it an automatic reaction? No, it's not. No, it's not. How do we know this? We know because if you get a group of people together and show them something funny, they're much more likely to laugh than if you get one person. So why do we laugh? We laugh to connect. The reason we laugh is it's a social reaction to say to other people, hey, join in with me. Enjoy this experience. I want to connect with you. Now, just take that as one example. We are really well set up to connect with other people, but we've got to be given a head start. We've got to be given a space to do it in. And we've got to be thrown together. And the thing is, we do actually now know quite a lot about what it is that works when it comes to connecting with people.
And I'd love to come, because I know you've got some great tips on what we can do, both sort of as a big picture of society and also what we can do individually. And I really want to make time for those, and then we'll come on to questions. But I'm also just holding something that I want us to not lose. So this topic links, in my mind at least, to the sense of the importance of diversity and sort of, recognizing the differences around us. And I'm also conscious about that as a middle-aged, white, straight, educated man talking to someone who's probably got a reasonably similar background to me, that there's an element of this seeming a little bit preposterous almost. And I myself have been on a real journey around topics to do with diversity and inclusion since the murder of George Floyd really brought that, firmly into lots of our minds in a way that it perhaps hadn't been as much as it should have been previously. And so I've done some exploration around this personally, and I've recognized, I think, a barrier that I've had historically, because like you, I really love this idea of common humanity and seeing every life as mattering and valuing people regardless of where they're from, and see that as a real important driver of well-being. But what I think I was doing in that is minimizing difference, sort of saying we're all the same, everyone matters. And I was failing to see that people from a different ethnic background, for example, have a radically different, not only sort of experience of life, but set of, you know, barriers they may face, issues. And so something about this sort of connecting across with people who aren't like us is also for me about like being able to notice and value and like really appreciate difference rather than trying to find similarities necessarily. How do you feel about that?
I think there's two things here. The first is that we must be aware that there's some things about our fellow humans that we're never going to fully understand. And actually that diversity, particularly in leadership, therefore is critical. Let me say what I mean. You know, the charity that I lead works on reducing violence, youth violence. Here in the UK, that is a challenge that is disproportionately affecting friends and colleagues of mine and people I don't know who are people of colour. And we have disproportionality in the way that policing affects people. We have disproportionality in the way that government policies affect people. We have disproportionality in the way that crime affects people. I will never fully understand that. I can learn the statistics, I can tell you it, I can read stories, I can talk to my friends, but I'll never deeply fully understand that. And actually, it's really important that the charity I lead has a diverse leadership team and a diverse staff, because that helps us to understand collectively better, even though I personally won't fully understand. So I think that's the first thing. We should really recognize each other's differences, and we shouldn't try and smooth them out. I am really reluctant to this idea of common humanity as the defining quality of a person. I don't think it is for most of us. I think we have these different identities that are much more personal and unique. But lots of identities still overlap. There's lots of common ground still without trying to level down the difference. So I give you my friend, we talked about this before, my friend Jawad. Jawad is a Sunni Muslim who I worked with, who lives in Pakistan, and we were thrown together on a project. And I remember people saying, oh, this would be interesting. Jon is a committed Christian, Jawad's a committed Sunni Muslim. Oh, wow, it'd be really interesting how this difference works. We connected more than probably anyone else in the group. And not because I think his Islamic faith is the same as my Christian faith. I think that'd be deeply patronizing of him for me to say that. But because there are certain things we hold in common. So, for example, we find hypocrisy in faith infuriating, and we connect over it and we understand it. And so I think we mustn't level down our differences, but we can find things that we do have in common that are genuine. And we sometimes underplay those at the same time.
Thank you. That's a really wise response. Let's come on to your great tips then. And I want us to talk about both big picture and personal. Let's start with the big picture. What are some of the things we might want our leaders to do? What would be your top 3 things that we can do as a society to help put this right?
Yeah, so I should be open and transparent and say that I am ambitious about this problem. I think it's a serious problem. I think it's as serious a problem as trying to think about literacy or numeracy, for which we opened schools and made them mandatory. I think we should come up with solutions that make us at least go, sorry now. So I think we do need something actually quite significant. So this is what I've been pushing, and I will continue to push for us to be doing. I would like us to find moments in a person's life where they are required to connect with people who are different from themselves. An immediate reaction of most of us is, oh, it sounds like an extraordinary fascist idea, how appalling. Let me explain what I mean in practice. My children will spend 1,500 months in the education system here in the UK. They're required to be educated. I would just like them to have 1 month of those 1,500 that they spend with children from all sorts of different schools, doing something together in the community. I would like them to learn how to get on with other people through that experience. The second one, many of us will start a family. When I talked, we did a research project with new parents, and they said pretty much universally, we feel uniquely hopeless. Everyone else can do it, but I can't. I think there's a moment there to connect parents together, to fund them and give them some support, and to help them to understand how the child's brain is developing, but to do it with parents from across town who aren't your friends, who aren't just like you. And the third is retirement. people, when they retire, we've worked blinking hard. And actually many of us end up, lots of us get involved, but a lot of us end up, especially men, a bit lonely. I'd like there to be a national retirement service that says to people, you've given back. Now we'd like to support you a bit. We're going to support you with the pension, but also we're going to get you involved and introduce you to some ways you can keep using your skills in the local community. 3 new institutions to knit our society back together.
That's brilliant. And I'd also like to just take a moment to credit you with being involved in getting the National Citizen Service, which is one of these initiatives to help young people meet from across different backgrounds, which I know is still running now. I think it was you that told me, John, that typically when the kids from different backgrounds get thrown together on that kind of program, they're very often on the phone to mum and dad the next day going, I don't like it here, the people aren't like me, I can't stand it, take me away, why am I here? And yet 3 weeks later, they've got these best friends from completely different backgrounds that they would never have otherwise had. So it's really interesting that we have this built-in resistance, and yet once you break through it, something really amazing happens.
Absolutely right. And the key to it is not talking about these things. It's not, I mean, some of us like over intellectualizing stuff. You can probably hear that I quite like over intellectualizing stuff. It's not how connection happens. Connection happens through doing stuff together side by side, through a shared intense experience, or oddly through routine, doing something routinized together, like having a meal, something that says you do it, I do it, we do it together. We're just programmed to find a connection when we do things together. And that's what you see with these teenagers, that on the first day or two, why am I with these people? By the end of a week, you move me out of this group, I'll be really unhappy about it because this is my group. Are they all perfect? Do I love them all? No, but they're my group. And that's what human nature can do when you throw people together and you do it well.
So let's come to the personal. I've been moved as always by what people are sharing on the chat. And I get a sense that we have a community here, hundreds of people who would love to feel more connected across boundaries, not only to see the system change, but to be part of that change. So what are some of the things we can do individually?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of stuff that we can do, and I'm just going to pick 3. But the book lays out 32 things you can do right now. If you don't like these 3, there's more. But these are 3 that I think are worth focusing on. The first one is social media. If you use social media and you follow people, if you're on Twitter, for example, have a look at who you follow. Just, after this is over, take a look at, the last 10 people to message or tweet. Do you agree with them on everything? If you agree with them on everything, particularly sort of politically, add a couple of other people who you disagree with. I don't mean sort of awful, beyond the pale, trying to divide society people. I mean just people who think differently than you on things. So you're just hearing a different point of view, you're understanding, you're sympathizing. And I'd encourage you to look at a diversity of political views, a diversity of backgrounds, throw a few people in who are different. The second is join something. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, clubs and societies were key for connecting people together. Join something, find something you'd like to do and join. Go to 4 sessions. If you hate it, stop. Well done. You had a go, but you might love it. Keep going. So that'd be the second one. The third one is hospitality. Once a year, invite some neighbours round for a cup of tea. If you want to do more, make it a meal, fine. But start with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. You don't have to invite the whole street, but don't pick who you invite. What I mean by that is just do it by proximity. Pick the 4 people who live nearest, or the 5 people, or roll a dice. But if you pick, people like me syndrome kicks in. 3 things that we could all do.
So let's recap. So sort of try and tune in to people who you might disagree with or different opinions, join something, anything really that helps you connect, and then invite people around. I love those ideas. On that first one, I've been consciously trying to read a much broader range, listen to a much broader range of political perspectives, things that, extreme left or extreme right. And I found myself disagreeing quite a lot with the things I'm hearing as part of that process. But one of the things that's been interesting for me is when I'm hearing a viewpoint that I disagree with, because I'm hearing the person saying it, I'm starting to understand that, okay, well, they've got a reason behind it. And actually it is coming from some value. So instead of me thinking evil person with bad point of view, I'm thinking, okay, I disagree with the point of view and the logic, but they're not coming at it because they're evil. They're coming at it from a different perspective. And that's just really humanizing, actually, across. I
completely agree. Is there anything more human than being wrong? Listening to someone who's got a different point of view that you believe to be wrong. It's great. It's great. And you realize okay, I do disagree, but I can see why you're there. I can see how you've thought it through, or I can see the mistake you made, and that's fine too, because that's very human. But yeah, listening is so important.
So this brings us actually on to some of the great questions that people are posing. So just to remind you folks, if you'd like to submit a question on the Q&A, now is a great time to do it. But also, if you see another question you like the look of, please upvote it, because then we'll get to the top of the list that I'm looking at. Michelle has asked, sort of linked to the point you were just making, but perhaps looking at the darker side of it. Why do you think our society has become so toxic? She says she's noticed that even when someone asks a question on a forum, you see like insensitive replies, lack of a supportive environment, anger, negativity. I mean, it feels to me that part of that's to do with the fact that we're slightly anonymized in these digital spaces, but what's going on there at the sort of people like me level?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, I think online anonymity is part of it. You know, and people take the opportunity to think there's no comeback and it's fine. But I do think there's a couple of other things. So one is the ease of which it is to say of these people, oh, they're beyond the pale, or they're just always wrong. And I think that does come back to a lack of friendships. You know, I'm struck that, you know, that I've been in, I'm sure we've all had this experience, I've been with a group of people who are very similar on a topic, and another group comes up and everyone slags them off. And I think none of you know any people in this group at all. And there's no one in this group here from that group. So I'm going to say something. But the people talking are nice people. They just don't, they're not thinking of anyone they know. And so I think that the sort of siloization of a society makes this so much more easy. I think the other thing though here is, if we think about in real life, why do some companies get toxic? What we learn about what works for people coming together is, yes, intensity, yes, routine, but the final bit is equality of status. Equality of status is really important. Why? Because humans get really insecure really easily, and we think that someone thinks they're better than us and someone's having a go at us, and then we start pecking and fighting. If you want a company to be one where people can connect well together, the leadership has to be humble enough to admit they make mistakes, to not lord it over other people, and to create an environment of welcome. It's my primary first thing I want to do as a leader, because it means that people don't try and henpeck. They don't try and toxically fight. They feel like they're being treated with equal respect. And that means people start to connect and they have space together.
I think that's really helpful, Jon. And I think you've partly answered B's question here, but maybe you want to build on it more. So her question is, from your experience, what's the best way to join teams of people together when one part of the group is willing, but the other part sort of refuses to listen or reflect on their own behavior, or they might be treating others with disdain? What is there anything beyond what you've just said that's relevant there?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend obviously on the circumstance. That, you know, one person's lack of willingness to engage it can be the individual's belief that something's being done badly, and actually they're not welcome, they're not included. So I think my starting point would be to try, and it's not easy, but to try and engage with the individual. I mean, in a corporate or a company setting, what good leadership would do is it would set the norm that we do try and engage. Doesn't mean we agree. Conflict is really necessary. We do try and engage, and someone who persistently refuses to knows that they've got to move, because it's not the way to act. And in that context, where the person has a duty to move, you kind of can then start to have a conversation. What's going on? What's troubling you? Something's up. You know, what is it? And often I find that then someone reveals something's actually causing the problem. But if that sort of behavior is just tolerated in an organization, it does become really difficult, I think.
Yeah, that's a really sort of nuanced answer. Thank you. I'd like to come on to something we haven't talked about actually very much so far, with the pandemic and COVID, and to what extent that links to what we're saying here. Because Sarah, or maybe it's Sarah, apologies if I pronounced that name wrong, is just asking, do you think the pandemic has made things harder and separated people even more because we got used to isolation and not sort of being together with each other?
Yeah, there's a fantastic story of the former Chinese president being asked what the impact of the French Revolution was, and saying it's too early to tell. I mean, I do think there's a little bit of, we don't really know some of the impacts of the pandemic. The two things I do see is that a lot of the places where we did connect got disrupted. You know, why did most of us stop dancing the EPAM? Society changed. You know, we lived indoors, therefore you don't want to dance outdoors. Change does disrupt our ways of connecting, and the pandemic was a big change. And there is a question about whether those clubs, societies and groups will flow back together. but there also were little bits of hope in the pandemic. I was struck, it didn't happen on my street, but I was struck how many streets built little WhatsApp groups that connected people in the street together, and everyone was invited to join. It wasn't just the people like me. And so you see little bits of hope as well as bits of disruption. So I think it's all to play for. I think we can rebuild and strengthen.
Yes, I've certainly been connected to neighbours who I didn't know before and are more different through that. So that's a nice example. One of the things that come up a lot in both the sort of places you meet people like you, but also where you maybe meet people not like you in the chat earlier, was volunteering. Got mentioned in both ways around. Cam's asked an interesting question. Have you got any comment on volunteering outside of your own kind of normal crowd as a good way to build new relationships? Because if we just volunteer within our own circle, whether it's the work or club or church, we might miss opportunities to build those new sort of outside relationships.
Yeah, I think, if you're up for it, trying to find a way to volunteer with people who might seem a bit different is a brilliant thing to do. The thing I would just really encourage you with is sometimes if you are volunteering and you're getting involved, you may well find that you are meeting people who are different from yourself. You've just got so used to it. I'm struck how many people say, this is a very particular example, well, a church doesn't count because it's just full of people who are Christians, or a mosque doesn't count because it's just full of people who are Muslims, or a Sunday assembly, mostly atheist agnostic group, that doesn't count because there's no people of faith there. Well, hang on, there's people of often quite different generations there. If things are working well, there are people of different income brackets. So we shouldn't sort of ignore where there will be coming together, that you may already be part of where you are volunteering. But yeah, if you can step out and go somewhere new, I applaud it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, and you gave an example of this, maybe unintentionally earlier, but you talked about your love of football. And of course, football, you might say, well, everyone loves football. They're all just football fans. But of course, what you get at a football game is an incredible range of gender, age, socioeconomic background, and so on. So, there's something that you have in common, and yet there's so much that is different, and that is an example of where we perhaps get that difference. I'm also struck that this is about more than just, it's a great question about volunteering, but I feel there are opportunities in everyday life. And as many of you know, I had the great privilege of meeting the Dalai Lama a couple of times, and when I hosted him in London, there's a huge entourage that comes with him, and of course they're all keen that he meets the right dignitaries or does all the right things. But what I saw in him was he wasn't really interested in who the right person to speak to was. He was interested in smiling at the cleaner and just connecting with anyone who was he was just like, there's a human here, and he saw the human, not the kind of position and status.
I completely agree. I remember when this is maybe a slightly unfair example, but I remember when my first child was born, and we're in the hospital waiting to take her home, and I went to the kitchen to get a mug, and there was a sign saying, leave your mug in the dishwasher, the cleaners will take care of it. And I was like, isn't that interesting? The cleaners will take care of it, not we will take care of it. Whoever wrote that note saw the cleaners as someone other, someone different. Whereas to me, it was the hospital. It was a group. It should be a team. And it's an unfair example. People in hospitals work colossally hard, et cetera, et cetera. But, how often do we in our sort of work, in our insecurity to get on with the boss and feel like we're part of, not stop to say hello to everybody and connect to everyone? I think it's colossally important.
Been more ever since we've been able to go back into work environments. I'm in a sort of co-working space. I've been going out of my way to chat to anyone, whether they're security on the door or helping clean up the kitchen, or I'm just chatting to them in the lift. And some people look at me like I'm slightly mad, but I find it's like a chance to. I really recognise how much I've missed that, being with other human beings in that time where we were so locked away. So I'm really glad that question about COVID came up. Let's come on to a topic we've touched on already, but I think it's worth diving into a little bit more. Social media. Both Sue and Peter have asked questions about it. Sue said, be interested to know your views about social media to connect with each other. It's been great in lockdown in some ways, but maybe there's some downsides. And Peter sort of asked the opposite side of that, is social media responsible for increasing our polarization and toxicity?
So I think social media, I use it. I'm on most of it. I don't use it lots. I use Twitter the most. I think it's broadly not helpful on this stuff. It is to choose who to connect with, the more likely we are to connect with people like us. And on social media, it's super easy to choose who you want to follow. Whereas in real life, actually disconnecting from a friendship is quite difficult. And so social media, I think, is not great from that point of view. But you know, it can be done well. I mean, it's full of opportunities. It's full of opportunities for us to choose to connect with other people, to find other people to listen to. I think sometimes, though, we do overstate the impact of social media. So on division. So, you know, we've been dividing for 40 or 50 years now and becoming less connected. And there was a technology that really pushed this, and it wasn't social media. It was the technology that arrived in the 1950s and 60s, which is when clubs and society started to decline, because people found that this technology was so much fun, they could stay indoors rather than go out to their clubs. And that technology was the television. Now, I love the television, but if we really sort of look at it analytically, I think the TV probably actually has done more harm for some of our connecting with each other than social media has. And so that's what we probably need to find a way to respond to.
Yes, in some ways, the behaviour on social media we're seeing now is a symptom of an underlying shift towards bubbles and away from togetherness rather than the cause in some extent. Yeah, thank you. Jana's asked a really interesting question. She says she's biracial, and biracial people sort of, by definition, bridge across racial divides. How does a people like me syndrome affect biracial people, or how does society reconcile biracialism, and how can that affect trust and happiness? What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's a phenomenally good question, but I'm also conscious. You know, we talked earlier about, you know, what mustn't do, try and narrow down differences. I'm not biracial. You know, the limit of my ability to answer should be really noted. But a couple of things that I would sort of just note: when you do look at research about mixing across ethnicity, and this probably won't be a surprise to the person asking, people who are biracial tend to mix more than anyone else. You know, that, and you know, the conversations I have with friends who are biracial, you know, there is this sense of, well, I have to, you know, I have to have this connection with both. I can see the similarity in both. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. But if I flip it a bit, most of us have more than one identity. It's not one that society maybe notices or causes so much sort of focus on, but most of us are a mixture of different things or different types. We're a young person, but we also love chess. We're elderly, but actually we drive a motorbike. You know, most of us are a mixture of things that don't always go together in public perception. And we work out how to be a bit of this and a bit of that. And I think the more we can find ways to realize we're not just one thing. Actually, we all cross divides, and we're good at it when we try it. And there's a lot we can learn from people who are biracial.
Thanks, Jon. It's a slightly sort of tangent jump of a question, but actually coming back to the overarching theme of Action for Happiness, you know, I'm glad you referred to the benefits for our happiness and well-being of being more connected. Oya has just asked to you, Jon, what makes you really happy?
That's a great question. You know, I think the main thing is don't take yourself too seriously. I mean, that was the thing that I learned from my father. Died about 20 years ago, but that was the thing I most learned from my father. You know, he was one of these people who people tended to have a lot of respect for, but behind closed doors, he was excellently good at laughing at himself. And I sort of think, you know, we've got 70 years and 10 plus a bit, thankfully. You know, nothing I do will last. It's not worth taking too seriously. You know, I'm a ginger-haired bloke with, as I say, with a bit of a lisp, who can't throw well or do any sport. That's funny. Like, you know, I think there's something about, you know, taking yourself lightly, and I find most of the joy comes from realizing nothing matters that much. And there's a lot of joy to be had in just realizing most of the things you worry about are not that serious if they're about you looking silly.
That's a really nice perspective, and not one that is a very common answer to that question, because I've obviously asked a lot of people about what makes them happy. I have been inspired by your work to try to connect across boundaries. I'm certainly still floundering around, and I make sort of slightly cumbersome attempts to connect with people, and I get things wrong about, you know, sort of, I'm still finding my space with that. How can I recognize difference and appreciate difference in a way that makes people feel, you know, well, it feels natural to them, and I don't make anyone else feel awkward, which is something that I struggle with. But I wanted to do a shout out to something called the Roots program, which I was introduced to, which is it's sort of being developed by a social entrepreneur group of people, and it basically tries to connect people from different backgrounds together. And I tried this out and had a lovely experience meeting someone from a different sort of age group, part of the country, different background to me. And we had a lot of differences, but we also had an amazing amount of similarities as well, which I found really engaging. And I just have sort of made it a bit of a commitment now to try and find more ways to connect with people who really notice difference and be willing to see other perspectives. So I'm grateful to you for having inspired that. We're going to send out an email tomorrow with a link to this video and with some things people can do to follow up on your work. But Jon, is there any final thought you'd like to leave us with? We've got a couple of minutes left.
I think the final thing would be have hope, take hope. Humans have been around for a reasonably long time. Think other people are going to reject us, and the truth is most of the time they're not. They're going to be curious too. So take a step, walk across the room, say hello.
Great thought to end on. Jon, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your inspiring work. I would encourage everybody to check out your book, Fractured, which we'll send a link to tomorrow. And in particular, encourage everyone to follow up on your tips to sort of stand up for us wanting things like a national citizenship education, family connection, retirement service, but also the things we can do in our own lives, inviting people around, listening to different opinions, and just being willing to connect and reach out. So you've been an inspiration. Thank you for your time. And thank you everyone for participating in this and for all the lovely comments and questions. It's been a really thought-provoking session. Thank you.